Hello and welcome to another episode of ORF US Dispatch. As we enter the final leg of the 2020 US presidential election, all polls indicate a clear Biden victory. However, given America's unique characteristic of deciding presidential elections through an electoral college and not the popular vote, and elections in times of intense polarization being a matter of mobilization and not persuasion, it is important to ask if this election will hold some surprises. All right, Dhruva, let's start with the polls. Over the past few months, Joe Biden has maintained a double digit lead. But can polls be trusted this time around, especially since in 2016 they were so off the mark? There is, of course, a sense this time that Biden's lead is wide enough to even account the degree to which polls were wrong in 2016. So, case in point, Biden has a healthy double digit lead in Pennsylvania, so as compared to Hillary's 4 point advantage around this time in Pennsylvania. But there's also a sense that polls are merely snapshots in time and they're not indicative of what the results might be, especially since in 2016, polls failed to account for the many working class voters who were pivotal in Trump's victory. So this time, are you reading polls with a sense of caution?
So the short answer is yes. I think it's worth looking at the polls with a great degree of caution. But a few things to keep in mind that make this year a bit different from 2016. One is partly to overcompensate for the mistakes of 2016. There's a lot more and a lot better polling in the battleground states, including places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which were the surprises from last time. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. The quality of polling and the regularity of polling has been better this time around. Second, the polling has been much more consistent. So there haven't been wild swings in the polls, which suggest again a greater degree of acceptability, of consistency. And finally, I think unlike last time, there's less of a chance of there being silent Trump voters, which were people who said who refused to say to pollsters that they were voting for Trump, but actually did go out and vote for Trump, giving him a slight boost. So now after 4 years, there's less likely that people who are secretly in favor of Trump are likely to be so reticent amongst pollsters. So these things suggest that the polls are a bit more accurate this time around and a bit more reliable. And I think, but that being said, I think it's always worth looking at these things with a great degree of caution.
All right, let's discuss states. Now, winning a handful of electorally crucial states is really important in American presidential elections because such elections are not determined by the popular vote but by the Electoral College, wherein the outcome is determined by a series of winner-take-all districts. So this was evident in 2016 with Trump picking up the crucial states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin by 0.2, 0.7, and 0.8 percentage points. But he took the cumulative 46 electoral votes of those three states, and this was crucial in Trump getting the 270 electoral college votes needed to win the US presidency. Now, Dhruva, what are the odds that Trump pulls this off once again?
So I think this will come down to really just a handful of states. The three key ones that Hillary Clinton lost last time: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. But Florida as well. And, I think basically whoever wins, if one of the candidates wins Pennsylvania and Florida, they basically won the election. I mean, it'll almost hinge on these two, three states. Some of the models, for example, 538's model gives Trump still a 13% chance of winning, despite the current, despite the current polling data. That's not large, but that's not inconsequential either. So there is a scenario whereby even given what we know at the polls, that Trump manages to sweep the swing states and get enough to cross 270. That scenario is not completely out of the realm of possibility. And finally, I think we're about a little over 2 weeks out from the election in the US, and at this time of recording, and they have been some swings in the past. I think nobody has gone from a position that Biden is in the polls to losing the election, but there are very few cases of that historically. But in 1980, for example, polls showed Jimmy Carter and Reagan roughly tied. And in the last few weeks, it swung very decisively in Reagan's favor, so that he had he essentially won by a landslide in the 1980 election. So, there are changes that are possible at the last minute.
All right, moving to voter turnout, which, by the way, was another major factor behind 2016 polls getting it wrong. Some analysis now indicate that Trump won in 2016 not because he mounted an effective campaign, but because the Democrats suffered from a serious low voter turnout problem. Case in point, Wisconsin. As discussed, Trump won Wisconsin, but he received the same amount of votes, nearly the same amount of votes as Mitt Romney did in 2012 when he lost Wisconsin to Obama. Whereas Hillary is being said to have received 240,000 votes less than what Obama received in 2012. As per a study, a low black voter turnout alone could have cost Clinton 88,000 additional votes in Wisconsin, which, by the way, would be thrice the amount of Trump's victory margin in that state of 27,000 votes. Now, cut to 2020. As of mid-October, when we are recording this, there has been a unprecedented rise in early voting. This is mostly aided by mail-in voting, as the Democrats have long argued for. Whereas the Trump campaign is reaching out to voters in remote districts and counties in electorally crucial states like Ohio and Pennsylvania to sort of repeat the 2016 experience. Who do you think this is going to work out for? In the sense, are we just going to see another election where mobilization is going to be key? How do you read this?
So I think mobilization is key. I think the pollsters, both amongst Republicans and Democrats, publicly accept that. Traditionally, in a normal election, about 40% of the US population votes in any presidential election. That's not eligible voters, but overall percentage of population. In very unusual years, for example, the years that Obama won, which was based on a massive, coming out of particularly of youth voters, it was about closer to 45%. And so traditionally, I think the understanding is that the people who don't vote, that margin tend to be working class, people who can't leave their jobs find it difficult, people who find it difficult to leave their children to go out to vote, students. So those people, minority students who traditionally vote Democrat tend to be the ones who don't come out to vote often on election day. And so getting the message of go out and vote is really supported by the Democrats because it will favor them. There have been voter registration drives. And for example, some of the early voter registration drives in Pennsylvania, in fact, favored the Republicans. There were more registered Republicans that were brought in those efforts than registered Democrats, which would suggest that it favored Republicans. But overall, I think the conventional wisdom is that a greater voter turnout and voter mobilization will favor the Democrats over the Republicans. And that's in some ways the main area of contestation right now. Most people have made up their minds which way they'll vote. It's really about getting them to actually vote. The two contradictory trends a little bit. On the one hand, obviously the early voting, the Democrats are hoping for more early voting, again, because it will boost the overall voter turnout. But Republicans are also hoping that the margin of error is less than the number of mail-in ballots. And by calling into question, the hope is sometimes if it's a very tight race, that by calling into question the validity of some of the mail-in ballots and by alleging fraud or the prospect of fraud, that this could actually go to the courts and even the odds in Trump's favor. So you've seen for a while an effort by Trump himself sometimes to malign mail-in ballots and suggest that there's large-scale fraud underway. So I think that's getting quite messy, and there's therefore a sort of double-edged sword aspect to this. And really, in some ways, I think you're right that the actual voter turnout and number of ballots cast will perhaps have an inordinate effect on the outcome of this election.
All right, that's all for this episode. Until next time, take care and stay safe.